We've been talking about the latest development, the latest, I'd say, front opening up in this worldwide state of semi-war we seem to, and often open war we exist in now. And here to join us, we haven't talked to him for a while. We always look forward to his perspective. Here to join us to talk not just about Iran, but perhaps about the state of military situation in general, is our friend Major Danny Sjursen. Danny is a retired U.S. Army officer. If you haven't seen him on the program before or read his great work, he's a regular contributor to antiwar.com. He's also appeared in Los Angeles Times, The Nation, The Huffington Post, The Hill, Salon, and so on, Truth, Dig, Tom, Dispatch. He served combat duty, a couple combat tours of reconnaissance in Iraq and Afghanistan, taught history at West Point. He's been a strategist. He's also got a memoir, Ghostwriters of Baghdad, Soldiers, Civilians, and the Myth of the Surge. And without any further ado or introduction, Danny Sjursen, welcome back to the program.
Oh, I'm glad to be on. It's been a little while. Unfortunately, there's this strange dynamic that whenever I come on this show, as well as all the other many shows I go on, it usually means that something horrific has happened in the world. So that's just one of the dark realities of this business for me.
Yeah, I think even if you didn't come on the show, something horrific would happen. I think we just have a regular kind of heartbeat of like stupid and horrible stuff that happens. Unfortunately, correlation is not causality, as they say. But in any case, great to have you. You've been doing great work. Before we get into Iran, I wanted to comment on a couple other pieces you wrote over what for some people was a holiday break. And one of them that I really I appreciated, a couple in particular. One was on the Christmas truce of, I believe it was 1917 or early in the First World War. It's a story that's been around in legend and folklore, movies, so on, for a long time. I think there was a period when there was some pushback. That never really happened. It's apocryphal, but you wrote about it. I saw it in antiwar.com. It was meaningful, moving to me, and you tied it into what's going on today. So first of all, that happened, right?
It did. Up and down the line, there were these sort of simultaneous and spontaneous, gestures by both sides, specifically British and German, but not just, wherein, both sides in the trenches. Now, you have to understand, this is December 1914, okay? So the war has only been going on since like August 4th or 5th, okay? So we're talking a 4.5-month period when approximately 1 million soldiers on both sides combined died, were killed. Nothing like that had ever happened before in human history. Quite frankly, nothing has really happened since, at least at the outbreak of war, although overall World War II was bloodier. The soldiers in the trenches, then, as always, were mostly from the working classes. They mostly had more in common, frankly, with the men in the other trenches than they did with their senior officers and governmental officials. Well, Germans up and down the line started singing Silent Night in German, which is not all that different from the English language, quite frankly. They're quite similar. Soldiers, spontaneously, against the orders of their officers or their senior officers in many cases, got up out of the trenches and met in the middle of no man's land. Sometimes they used the opportunity to actually bury the dead, because oftentimes it was too dangerous to retrieve your dead. So, bodies would just sort of rot out there. And people brought Christmas trees. They exchanged cigarettes. They were singing. Most people didn't even bring their weapons. Some historians have wanted to say it was apocryphal, but I think what they maybe meant was that this wasn't necessarily an organized thing. But I think the spontaneity of it is the beauty. So, I'm happy that it worked out that way, because I think what it shows is that, and you guys know that I'm sort of on the left in an economic sense, but I think it shows the class consciousness and the class solidarity of those fighting these wars. There were strong socialist parties and strong social democratic parties and movements within all of the major belligerent powers, especially the Western powers. And so, there was this sense of commonality with the opponent. Now, almost all socialists and just about every social democrat did eventually back their own country. Nationalism overpowered class solidarity, sadly, as it always has for the most part throughout history, a few exceptions. Yeah, so this is what went on. Now, here, what I think is interesting about it is the response. Sometimes the nature or the significance of an event can be measured best by its response. And the response was from all the way up high to all the way down to the second lieutenant. They were told, the officers were told, never let this happen again on either side. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us that the powers that be at the time were afraid.
Right.
They were motivated by fear because this had the potential to take down the warfare system. And so what I argued is, now, of course, World War I is probably the most illogical and perhaps the most absurd war ever fought. Close on its heels, though less bloody, at least for Americans, is the 19-year American crusade in the greater Middle East. And what I argued for was a truce of sorts, a Christmas truce or any sort of truce in America's wars. Now, I don't suspect that will happen, and I was purposely doing a very Jonathan Swift level modest proposal here. But the point I'm trying to make is that despite religious differences, despite ethnic differences, despite all of these things, still to this day, even in a volunteer army, the average Taliban fighter and the average American soldier have far more in common than they do with the general officers leading them, or in the case of the Taliban, with the political figures that are moving them, specifically in many cases proxy leaders elsewhere. So I think the Christmas truce remains relevant. We were 105 years since the anniversary of the first and only Christmas truce of the war, and I plan to write about it every year. I hope I can find a new angle every year, and something tells me I'll be able to.
Yeah, it's two great things about this for me, reading your piece. One was, yes, I think you're right. From an economic standpoint, it shows, and I think this is why it frightened the chain of command, that every war is fought because the working class is willing to fight it. Which means if the working class ever decides it's not willing to fight it, you don't have your war capability anymore. And that I can see as being very threatening. And when you talk about having more, as a troop commander in Kandahar, for example, 2011, more in common in some ways with your local Taliban counterpart than with the commanding officers, especially in terms of a Christmas truce. A lot of Americans, for example, don't know this. I know you do, but Muslims revere Jesus Christ as a prophet, and not as the Son of God, but as a prophet second only to Muhammad. So, there is, you never know, right? I mean, it's always possible, but it's a fascinating take on, I think, a very, important, and to me personally, moving historical event. My grandfather fought in World War I. He was injured by mustard gas, never fully recovered. So, it's just, that struck me. And also, before we get to the, conflict du jour, if you will, in Iran, your piece on Jimmy Stewart, who many people know from It's a Wonderful Life, his other, Meet John Doe, his other famous movies, movie star of really my parents' generation, but your piece about Jimmy Stewart's military service and then his life with PTSD really was also, to me, deeply moving. So I don't know if you want to just briefly mention what you wrote about there.
Sure. My dad gave me the idea for the piece, which is interesting because we really don't talk politics. Trumpeter, and I'm the opposite. But he had read a short article about Jimmy Stewart's wartime service. And, I noticed that It's a Wonderful Life, as always, was on, all day, every day on Christmas Eve and Christmas on several channels. And I thought that the American people needed to hear their stories. This is one of the least political articles I've ever written, and it was purposely so, right? I just wanted to tell the story of a man from a different generation, a generation when the famous and the wealthy fought wars, saw it as their duty. A man who was profoundly damaged by that war. I mean, he commanded a squadron and in one instance lost 130 men killed in one mission. He lost his mind for a brief time and had to be grounded by his superior officers because he just couldn't handle losing so many people. He returned and was profoundly affected by all the symptoms of PTSD, or at least his version of those symptoms, and had trouble finding a role and other leading men were taking them, and he didn't want to take the role for It's a Wonderful Life. He wanted to do a comedy. After the darkness of the war, he didn't want to do anything serious, but he had no other offers, so he takes it. And of course, it becomes a classic, right? It becomes one of his classics, becomes a Christmas classic. My guess is it'll play on Christmas 50 years from now. But the reality is he channels so much of the darkness, so much of his fear, so much of his anger in many cases, and profound sense of hurt into the film. And I think you could see it on screen, but I think most Americans miss it. They watch it, but they don't realize that, like, this is the first movie he did after just returning from war, after having lost 30 pounds. His hairline is receding. I mean, in the article, I show 2 pictures. I mean, 2 years apart, you wouldn't even recognize the guy. But, Jimmy Stewart stays in the reserves, and flies a bombing mission in Vietnam right before he retires as a brigadier general. But the war never left him. He said later in life that really, he never really stopped fighting the Second World War, and he never really stopped fighting his demons. So what I asked at the end of the article is, next year when you, the reader, or you, the listener, watches It's a Wonderful Life, I don't need you to cry over Jimmy Stewart, but well, I do. But I think one ought to consider that facet of the movie, and also consider how much has changed in our society, where not a single Bush or Clinton or Trump or Romney or Obama has served, and nor will they, and nor has a single major Hollywood starlet or leading man. So I just think this is a profound thing. It's an apolitical story for the most part, and I was glad to tell it. And it was my honor, and it got a really good reception, and I'm glad it did.
Yeah, it also, by the way, Danny, and again, we're talking with retired Major Danny Sjursen. For those who are listening, it's Sjursen. If you want to look up his writing, it also made me look with a little more compassion to my father and uncle's generation, including I lost an uncle in World War II before I was born. But so it made me, and my mother was in the USO and so on. So made me look more compassionately at all of them too. So I really appreciated that piece. Now let's talk a little bit about Iran. And I wanted to start, you've written a couple great pieces about this, but I wanted to back up just a little bit in talking about Iran, because first of all, I saw these articles that said that senior Pentagon officials, they didn't identify whether they were military or civilian officials, but senior Pentagon folks told the press that they offered Donald Trump a range of options, and the one of killing General Soleimani was just so crazy and out there that they put it in there just to make the others look reasonable. And much to their shock and horror, that's the one he picked. Now, my reaction to that was, first of all, this is CYA. This is, covering your ass for the press, number one. But number two, if it really didn't occur to them that Trump might pick the craziest option, I've always been told, and I've worked with the State Department and elsewhere, I've always been told that a good military officer understands something about human psychology. And if you really think you're giving a briefing to Donald Trump with an idiotic option and there's no chance he's going to take it, the phrase I would use for that is military malpractice. But what, am I off base, or what do you think?
I'm really, really glad you asked me about this, because this is something I know a little about. And I can give you a little bit of the insider track on how the military does this, although albeit in my case at the lower squadron level. So we're talking about 600 soldiers. I spent 2 years as an operations officer and an assistant operations officer on the operations staff. My primary job was to make military plans and then brief them to the boss, right? Who in this case was the squadron commander. The standard practice, it's not exactly by the book, but the standard practice out in the field is that you present the boss for any problem, any military problem, with 3 options. Okay. And what we do traditionally is we create, now you shouldn't do this, but for expediency, everyone does. I mean, everyone's taught to do this. You present 3 options, 2 of which are throwaways. Okay. And the throwaways are always the weakest option, the most cautious one, too cautious, and then the most aggressive, too risky. Okay. And then there's always a Goldilocks solution in the middle. Now, so much do you expect the boss to always pick the middle solution that you craft it so he'll pick it. And before you even brief it, because you only have a limited amount of time to plan these missions, while you're briefing it, you've got your whole staff already back on their computers filling in the mission under the presumption he's going to pick number 2, right? So this is standard operating practice. I like to call it the Goldilocks method of operations orders. Now, you do have to tailor that to the boss. The scheme that I just described worked quite well with my first squadron commander, who was an extremely rational and intelligent and ethically strong man. Then a sociopath took over. I have this rare experience, although it's not that rare, quite frankly, because the military is full of sociopaths, which is another psychological problem we can deal with in another episode. When the sociopath took over, we quickly realized he's going to pick the crazy option, okay? Or he's going to send us back to the drawing board and pick none of them because he was a lunatic. And so what we started doing is we started tempering that third option to actually be the Goldilocks middle option. You know, we would create something even more extreme, perhaps, or we wouldn't, or we'd keep that as the extreme and make the other two too cautious. And so the point is, these generals ought to have known better, because what we have with Donald Trump is what I like to call the perfect storm of militarist, risky behavior, misbehavior. His temperament, combined with his ignorance, combined with his laziness, and massive ego/masculine insecurity, is such that one must expect him to take the most absurd and irrational choice. And so I'm embarrassed for the professional behavior of the generals who even gave him that option. Now, maybe he demanded it. And if that's the case and he went off script, there's only so much one can do short of a military coup, which I'm not calling for just yet. I tend to not like generals running my government. This isn't Argentina, after all. But
the Argentinians didn't like it either, by the way. But yeah,
no,
okay,
they didn't. They didn't. I heard a lot of them got disappeared. But the point I'm making is, look, this president's temperament is such that he changes the rules for how we brief him, and obviously the choice to assassinate, Soleimani, I think was abhorrent. We can get into that next as to why I think that, but I'll turn it back to you. But the point is, the insider track on how these briefings work, I think, is relatively important. And what I described at the squadron level is precisely what happens at the national level, just at a higher, grander macro scale.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And the generals who said we never expected him to take it again, I thank you for sort of affirming my reaction, which was, well, what were you thinking? And in terms of, I won't even go back a step on this, Danny Sjursen, which is, you said, the Goldilocks method, right? Too hard, too soft, right in the middle. You want them to pick the middle when there's a mission to be accomplished. Let's say that, that makes sense. We've got to secure this city or something. Here are 3 ways to do it. But I'm not even sure we, the American people, know what the mission was that options were being laid out for. I mean, we're being told, for example, I'll give you, I'm not a military person, but I am a trained journalist. And when I read an article in the New York Times or the Washington Post, it says Soleimani was prepared to kill hundreds of Americans, and so the government felt it ought to act. And when I see that in paragraph 1, and they said, well, that's interesting. I'd like to see the evidence of that, because that's an important fact in all of this. Perhaps the mission was to prevent the deaths of hundreds of Americans. Then I read nothing about it for 8 paragraphs. Then in paragraph 9, I see government officials said that Soleimani was about to kill hundreds of Americans. Wait a minute. You, the paper of record, just told me he was, as a matter of fact. Now you're saying that was an unverified statement by somebody you're not even willing to name, that's not willing to go on the public record. I am not convinced, A, that he was about to kill hundreds of Americans, B, that I'm sure it's possible, but I'm not convinced, B, that he had. The past statements about his record were necessarily verifiable in this area. And therefore, C, when those options were being presented to Donald Trump, options for what? What were they trying to do?
This is a great point, and I'm really, really happy to expound upon it. This has been on my mind a lot, and I was working out some of these thoughts in my podcast earlier this week. Options for what? Well, it seems to me that Donald Trump would have given the following commander's guidance to his people, to his briefers. I want to hit Iran, or I want some sort of escalation with Iran. Provide me options, right? So he was starting, I believe, from the viewpoint that whether it's because of impeachment and distracting from that, or because he, got a phone call from his old friend John Bolton, which is unlikely, but something like that, he decided he wants to escalate on some manner, right? And so give me options for escalation. So that's the first problem, right? Is he's assuming a bellicose stance with a country we're not technically at war with, right? Mm-hmm. The second problem is one of evidence. We've seen this collusion between a warlike administration and a pliant mainstream press before. When have we seen it? Well, over and over again in American history, but most famously, Vice President Dick Cheney. We know this emphatically, that Vice President Dick Cheney had his own office leak to the New York Times the falsified and unverified intelligence that the aluminum tubes were being used in Iraq, and they were going to be used to uranium. They leak it to the Times. The Times prints it. Cheney goes on Meet the Press or whatever show he was on, and then he cites the Times, the leaked, unverified data, as proof that we need to go to war. So he's feeding false intelligence, right? And then he's using it to justify himself. So look, even the New York Times, even the paper of record says we have to go to war, right? So we're seeing this again. Now, I will never again, ever, 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 I don't know if I said enough evers, trust my government again when it says officials say we were about to be attacked. Officials say we needed to do this in our defense. From now on, I want to know some evidence. I want to see it. And we won't, of course, because they'll say, oh, sources and methods will be, under threat. CIA agents will be killed. That nonsense has been used time and again to keep us in the dark. And that's where they want us, apathetic and in the dark. I will never again trust that sort of evidence. Why in the world are we supposed to take Donald Trump or any U.S. government administration's word for it ever again? Because I can think of 3 exhibits out of 50 that are enough, the preponderance of which is enough that we should never trust in that blindly again. Number 1, the lies that brought us into Iraq War 2003. Number 2, the CIA torture program and all the lies about the, enhanced interrogation techniques. And we found out in the CIA torture report, which took years to come out because the CIA fought it, tooth and nail, we found out that that was all a lie. And then just recently, how soon we forget, how soon it's out of the news. Isn't that, convenient? The Afghan war papers,
right,
showing that we've been lying about that war the whole time. Why should I ever trust the government at its word again without evidence? And then when they finally do brief Congress, only after the fact, which is not how the founders designed it, only after the fact about the strike on Soleimani, you have Mike Lee and Rand Paul, Republicans, saying it was the worst briefing they ever got, that the way, quote, the way the whole thing went down was un-American and unacceptable, and that they saw no evidence. They were presented no evidence. Even in a closed session briefing, they saw no evidence that there was an imminent attack. This is lies. So count me dubious, count me skeptical forever, count me cynical forever. I'm going to be wheeled around in a nursing home someday as an old curmudgeon yelling around to anyone who will listen, don't trust your government, because that's where we're at. That's what the wars of my lifetime have taught me.
Well, all I can add to that, Danny Sjursen, as an old curmudgeon, is that, when I was a high school student activist in 1970, and Daniel Ellsberg who's been on this program, released the Pentagon Papers, we learned that the U.S. government had been, and the United States military had been lying to the American people about Vietnam for many years. And then we learn about the lies bringing us into Iraq and the lies of George W. Bush, Dick Cheney. And then we learn about the Afghan Papers, the U.S. government, the U.S. military lying again all along about the progress of this war. But it's like, fool me once, shame on you, fool me for 60 years. And clearly I have some sort of problem accepting the fact that my government can't be trusted in these matters.
Most certainly. The Pentagon Papers and the Afghan Papers have so much in common. This is the Gulf of Tonkin incident presented us with a falsified fait accompli for war, just as I would argue the false intelligence, as I'm almost certain it's false, surrounding the imminence of Soleimani's personal threat. That was also falsified. That also presented us with a fait accompli, a de facto state of war. You know, I opposed this targeted assassination for three reasons. And just very briefly, number one is I think it was strategic, right?
Mhm.
I think it was a poor military decision. It was a poor strategy. It only escalated things unnecessarily, and it made us less safe. Number two, dubious international and domestic legality of assassinations in general when you're not in a state of war. And three, the lack of congressional sanction. The presentation of Congress with a dilemma from Trump's unilateral action and then leaving Congress to pick up the pieces rather than going to Congress for sanction ahead of time. Unless they can give us they should have given the Gang of Eight at least, right? So now we're talking about Speaker of the House, the minority leader, the Senate majority minority leader, and then the House and Senate leader and ranking members of the Intel committees. The Gang of Eight should have at least, at the minimum, I mean, I think it should have been an outright declaration of war, but at the minimum, they should have been briefed in a closed session as to the imminence of this prior to Trump presenting, a de facto state of war, an action tantamount to war, and a fait accompli to the Congress. This is what it did, what Trump did, and it's happened before, but he's just a more absurdist version of it because he's, personally a monster in terms of temperament. But he inverted the founder's system of war-making decision authority. He presented us with a state of war and then said, are you going to be Americans and support it, or are you going to be traitors and deny it, right? And so he gave us that binary, dichotomous choice, and it works, right? It works time and again. How do I know it works? Because more than ever, and I've been at this for 5 years, more than ever, I received more threats of physical harm, more trolling about being a traitor and being un-American, being pro-Iran, secretly working for Putin, whatever, more in the last 48 hours than at any other, crossroads in my, political writings. So this tells me that Trump's stratagem, right? Trump's, decision to take us to war and then present us with only two options, it's effective. It's been effective since 1776, but it's been particularly effective, I would argue, since the end of the Second World War.
And one of the things that that we're up against, I think, is certainly the Democrats are not in a position, or they don't seem to have an inclination to push back on any of this. I mean, I'm sure some of them think it's politically challenging to do so. I think also I think I hear a lot of, not from you, Danny, but from, a lot of people in social media and commentary, columnists and so on, are outraged, rightfully, correctly, that Donald Trump would commit an illegal and extrajudicial assassination. But, if they come from the Democratic side of the House, I don't hear a lot, for example, about the precedent that was set when Barack Obama authorized the assassination of a United States citizen by drone attack, which was followed by the drone killing of his 16-year-old son, also a United States citizen. So, I mean, it seems to me, you and I have talked about this before, but it seems to me that while the Democrats, when in power, have not been lunatics at the Trump level, and I commend Barack Obama for the nuclear deal with Iran that Trump has torched, but it seems to me we don't have in this country a coherent worldview being expressed that says, this is not the only way to exist and be a nation in a complicated world. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
100%. I do think, and I agree with you, that Barack Obama's finest hour on the world stage was the Iran nuclear agreement and the concomitant normalization or attempt towards normalization of relations with Iran, the de-escalation of a near state of war. That was his finest hour. It's gone, right? It's been wiped off the slate. The problem, I think, with Democrats is that they, like the Republicans, while less insane, usually, right? And I'm not afraid to say that anymore, by the way. The Republican Party, with a few exceptions, is so far off the rails that I no longer worry about ad hominem attacks. I'm fine with it. But anyway, the Democrats, while less insane, they too act like history started yesterday.
Right.
Or specifically like we're operating in a vacuum and history started on one of two days, either Friday when Trump assassinated Soleimani with respect to this issue, or in November 2016, right? The day that Trump was elected, history began. And the problem with this, and the problem with letting Barack Obama off the hook, as I've written, I think it's the title of my articles, the problem with this is manifold. Specifically, if you let Obama's Justice Department off the hook for secretly sanctioning the killing of an American citizen without due process, right? They said we had the right to assassinate Anwar al-Awlaki and his son. And oh, by the way, his daughter was killed in a Navy SEAL raid under Trump. But nevertheless, we devastate this family, okay, without due process. And when asked about it, which very few Democrats asked about it, right? Very, very few. They just gave Obama a pass because they liked him. But the few Republicans, like the Rand Paul types who asked about it, were told, no, nothing to see here. Everything's fine. All's well that ends well. Our Justice Department investigated and wrote a memo, and they said it's fine. Now, how is that any different from Trump's assassination, right? Okay, nope. I think his assassination obviously has more geopolitical ramifications and is more risky, and you know, it's a worse behavior because of the potential results. But it's the same process. It's the same unit. Look, you cannot have your own appointed Justice Department that works for you, right? That has only limited independence and less every year, every administration, cannot have them sanction it. The idea of the separation of powers is that, like in a courtroom, there's supposed to be an adversarial relationship between the three branches so that they're asking tough questions, right? So that you have Senate investigators who don't work for the president investigating, you know, or you have courts, right, from the judicial branch, you know, observing whether something is legal and constitutional. So I think it's really dangerous to let Obama off the hook. The last thing I want to say about the Democrats, the only thing I hate more in Washington than a Republican is a Democrat, at least an establishment one. They provide us, just like the two major liberal news networks, they provide us with very little context to this whole operation, right? So the assumption at the starting assumption for both Fox News and MSNBC is Soleimani bad. Right. Soleimani bad. Soleimani terrorist, right? Before anyone says we shouldn't have assassinated him, they feel obliged to say, oh, yeah, he's a bloodthirsty monster. Now, I'm not a particular fan of Soleimani, so in a sense, I'm doing that too. But you know what I want to hear? That we're never going to hear, ever on the three major cable news networks. What I want to hear is, why does Soleimani exist? What does the IRGC exist? Why did Iran feel it necessary to build relationships and proxy forces throughout the greater Middle East? Could it be because more than anything driving Iranian policy is to avoid one thing, which is the catastrophic, Persia-destroying, nearly destroying, existential Iran-Iraq war, the bloodiest conventional war of the second half of the 20th century, whereby the United States supported, backed, funded, and enabled an illegal, aggressive Iraqi invasion of Iran that almost resulted not only in the fall of the new Islamic Republic regime, but the destruction, potentially, of Persian Iranian society. Now, in order to avoid that, Iran felt it necessarily to, just like we did after World War II, to avoid another cataclysmic war, to put its intelligence agents, right, to put its proxies out there, to try to build relationships and create checks on a future invasion, specifically an invasion that was enabled by the United States, which, of course, is the most dangerous kind of invasion. So what I want to see is context. I want to see someone talk about, hey, we overthrew the first democratically elected prime minister in Iranian history.
I was going to mention America, that. Yeah.
America started it. So we started it. I wrote an article called Who Started It? I'll tell you who. We did.
Right.
Okay, we did. We started this whole thing. What about America, supporting the invasion? What about America shooting down an Iranian airline, killing 290 civilians? And then Vice President Bush saying he refuses to apologize. He will never apologize for America, even when we kill civilians. What about Operation Praying Mantis, when in response to a non-fatal underwater mine that damaged one of our ships, we decided instead to sink their Navy and kill several, who knows how many Iranian sailors? How did Iran respond to most of those actions? Very, very restrained, which is why the title of my second to latest article, which came out yesterday, is called what? The Islamic Republic of Restraint. In this instance, and in almost every past instance in our relationship with Iran, It was Tehran, not Washington. It was Tehran that gets the gold star for restraint, that gets the gold star for avoiding outright war. That doesn't mean that I absolve the Iranian government of its human rights abuses domestically or some of their actions internationally. What it does mean is that Iran deserves, not Trump, Iran deserves the credit for restraint, specifically because I truly believe they missed the American troops on purpose. And oh, by the way, I think the generals are lying about that. We can get into that later.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to start to wrap up. I agree with you about the restraint on the Iranian side, although, of course, we're grading on a curve with Trump on the other end. So, but I would also say, I guess as my final comment, then I'll give you a final comment in terms of mainstream media that, you can turn on either CNN or Fox or MSNBC and see the architects of the 19-year catastrophe in Afghanistan and Iraq now weighing in on what we should do about Iran. The other night I saw Senator Joe Lieberman, and to me, getting military tips from Joe Lieberman, I've said this before, but I'll say it again, is like getting navigation tips from the captain of the Exxon Valdez. But I will give you the last word.
Look, just two final things. What we're seeing is two news networks, and CNN and MSNBC, Fox is just state, but CNN and MSNBC are criticizing the Trump move. And in order to show that it's wrong, they're bringing on a cascade of all the folks for Bush and Obama who set the conditions for this, right? So instead of having Chomsky, Basovich, Chris Hedges, right, and Daniel Ellsberg on TV, they're persona non grata, we bring back John Brennan, and suddenly we've got Michael Hayden. That's the first problem. Here's what I want to end with, because I think the time for an anti-war movement has come. The time for Americans in the street has come. I've been saying it for years. I don't suspect it'll happen, but it needs to happen. And here's what I will say. Abraham Lincoln is the only president besides Washington who is equally adored by Republicans and Democrats. How did Abraham Lincoln start his career? How did he first get into the national attention? And how did he choose to spend his first inaugural speech in the House of Representatives in 1848? I will tell you how. In opposition to the Mexican-American War, to an aggressive war, to a war that President Polk started with a fait accompli. And here's the thing. You want to talk about political courage? Contra John Brennan, contra Joe Lieberman, all these clowns. Lincoln was a one-term congressman. And the reason he was a one-term congressman, the consensus of historians agree, is because he was anti-Mexican war. That's called courage. That's the sort of leadership we need in this country right now. And I'll tell you, until we have it, and until the people are in the streets, you and you're going to invite me back on next week for some other catastrophe. And that's the world we live in.
Yeah, no, you got it. And that's a great way to end. I have nothing to add to that except to say Major Danny Sjursen, again, Sjursen. Check out his writing. It's very important. And as always, Danny, great to talk to you, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks. Always a pleasure. Glad to do it.